بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين. اللهم ربنا أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي، ربنا زدنا علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي، ربنا زدنا علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصر أولياءك في غزة وفي الضفة وفي لبنان وفي فلسطين كلها وفي لبنان وفي اليمن وفي العراق وفي إيران وفي مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم انصرهم على عدوك وعدوهم إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم سدد رميهم وسدد خداهم وسدد رايهم وألف بين قلوبهم وأصلح ذات بينهم. اللهم فرج عنا وعن إخواننا في غزة وفي الضفة. اللهم فرج عنا وعن إخواننا في لبنان. اللهم فرج عنا وعن إخواننا في اليمن وفي مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم نفس كربنا وكربهم وثبت أقدامنا وأقدامهم والطف بنا وبهم يا أرحم الراحمين. وصلى وسلم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم وسلم. Okay, so we're continuing our reflections on why revolution is no longer possible by Mr. Professor Han. They're saying why is well, obviously he's asking question, but questions it's not the real question. He assumed that the answer is yes. Sorry, the question is complex in the sense that he is asking a question about why is it stable, but he's assuming obviously that it is stable. So why is neoliberal system of rule stable? So we can ask the question, is it stable? If it is stable, in what sense it is stable? And what does he mean by stability? So all these questions we can ask. Obviously there are many more questions we can ask, but these are obvious questions we can ask. And he's saying, what's the reasons for the stability of neoliberal system of rules? So we can firstly we can ask, what does he mean by stability? And or we can ask about, is it stable in itself or vis-a-vis alternatives or its oppositions or both? So these are all sorts of questions we can ask. And obviously we can ask more basic question that, is it even stable? So we can challenge the basic thesis if we think the thesis is incorrect, for example. Obviously we can also differentiate between, for example, so another question we can ask, I missed that, so I'll do it again, can ask is that, what's the difference between stable and robust system? Can a system be stable but not robust, or robust but not stable? Or um, system has to be stable or robust, or is there a meaningful difference between stable and robust in this context? So these are all sort of all these are sort of questions we can ask. Okay, but let's go through the paragraph first. So why is neoliberal system of rules so stable? Why is there so little opposition? So if there's no opposition, that means that it's stable vis-a-vis alternatives. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is stable in itself, for example. Um, so there is opposition, but probably it's little. So that opposition, which is little, what are its chances of growing and all those things? And obviously, within capitalist system, opposition. So when we talk about opposition to capitalism or neoliberal capitalism, so we can divide into opposition in the core of capitalism, advanced capitalist societies. And within that core, we can also talk about core and then periphery. But let's not go into on that uh, dimension for now. Then you have opposition within countries or regions which are not core but are closely associated with the core in terms of reaping its benefit or providing its cushion, for example. And then periphery, so opposition and periphery. So these are at least three types of opposition. So which type of opposition we are talking about? So probably what he is talking about is in the opposition within the core of capitalism, from the core of within the core of capitalism. And obviously here we can also make another, but probably stability at the level of government. So he's not talking about the stability of the level of stable system versus stable governments. So government can be stable. So instability of government doesn't necessarily imply instability of the system, but if there's too frequent, then it might refer back to something fundamentally wrong within the system or instability of the system. And obviously, system can be unstable, not very strong. We need to define stability in the first place, but uh, might not be prone to any revolutionary changes because of the lack of opposition or lack of a strong opposition or lack of alternative, many other things. So why all opposition swiftly go nowhere? Probably it's talking about opposition to um, opposition like Occupy Wall Street or environmental opposition. One thing which we can note about these oppositions is that um, the concept of revolution has been um, in a sense made unworthy of attention within core capitalist countries through various means, we can say that at least since the start of the neoliberal period, if not from before, and there are various reasons for it. One of the reason is that abundance create what Marcuse calls one-dimensional man. Co-optation of labor unions, for example. And nationalism has been an important aspect as well. Um, and uh, and we can't say whether it's just cause or effect, but the fact that legitimate violence, has become discredited. Um, so these things mean that opposition is not a revolutionary opposition to start with. The opposition he is talking about, the opposition which starts but goes nowhere, because these are single issue movements. They are not the oppositions which are aiming at overthrowing the system and establishing a new system. And since the collapse of Soviet Union, that has become totally obsolete within the core capitalist countries, even from before. So to saying that they are not going anywhere is a bit misleading, because it implies that they were going anywhere. The oppositions are normally, those single issue oppositions are sometimes successful, sometimes not. But since they are not the feminist movement or labor unions, etc., environmental movements, the anti-capitalist movements, so-called, they're all single issue movements. They don't aim to, or at least in practice, they don't aim to overthrow the current ruling system, capitalist system. They might, some of them might want to change the neoliberal system, but that assumes that neoliberal system can be changed without changing capitalism as a whole at this point. The collapse of neoliberal system wouldn't mean the collapse of capitalism, but it would mean the collapse of the most advanced form of capitalism to date. And so it's possible that neoliberalism self-destructs itself and it goes back to some previous form of capitalism, like social democracy or fascist capitalism or Nazi capitalism or nationalistic capitalism, etc., which it does in times of crisis if it cannot deal with the crisis. So the question, why does all opposition so swiftly go nowhere, assume that there was some systematic opposition to start with. So that's a bit of dissonance between my objection to the why is there so little opposition to all opposition. So there might be opposition, but that opposition is not a systematic opposition. And then it's a why is revolution no longer possible despite, obviously that's he is assuming, despite the ever greater gap between the rich and the poor. The gap between rich and poor is relevant because it's the hallmark of neoliberal capitalism. But the thing is, we need to understand the nature of this gap. It is actually potentially a dangerous gap for capitalism. But this gap, at least in the core countries of capitalism, the gap is not what is important. What is important is upward mobility. And enough people are rich, over 50%. Enough people are rich in the core countries, and there is upward mobility, like at least there is a hope that people can become rich or become less poor, for example. And that is rich as compared to. So that's what rich mean for a person who is poor. And there is enough people who can upwardly mobile, who are upwardly mobile, and there are enough people who are rich at different levels. So that's a critical mass. You don't need a majority in any country, probably to change a system. You need to mobilize 3-4% of the population. So if 3-4% of population are committed to a system and they are rich and they are educated in this system, then they can, and the others people follow them, then obviously that reduces the chances of any fundamental change. So just because there is a gap, and that's a fundamental gap, and that's a dangerous gap for capital, given the other things I just said, the gap is relative always. Rich and poor, these are relative terms, and there is a possibility of upward mobility. At least there is people can imagine, or people can think that they can upwardly move on. They can move upward, etc. if they work hard. And if there are enough people who are rich at different levels, then the opposition sort of stymies. And obviously, poor, really poor, they can't do anything on their own. But if people who are educated in the system and who are in the active echelon of the system, if they think that they are not, they lose their hope or prospects, then they might organize, etc., and try to make some drastic changes. But until that happens, just because there's a gap between rich and poor and the gap is increasing, in its own is not sufficient to mobilize people towards revolution, let alone change in the system of rule. And by the way, I should have mentioned that when he's talking about system of rule and changing system of rule, that doesn't necessarily mean revolution. System of rule can be changed and that can be revolution, but it might not be revolution. It depends on what type of rules they are and what type of changes those are. So if we go back from neoliberalism to fascist capitalism, that's a revolution in a sense, but it's not a revolution from capitalism to some other system. We had fascism and we have nationalist capitalism before. And even today, neoliberal capitalism is, to a certain extent, nationalist or national neoliberal capitalism. So going back to nationalism won't be a revolution as such. Okay, an explanation requires first that we understand how power and rule function today. What's power? What are the rules? and power. 2. So what's the role of power and rule and their relationships? So he's going to talk about that. So let's do this next time, and then we can talk about what power is and what rules are, etc. Okay. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك وصلى الله تعالى على رسول خير خلق محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.